Hi, this is Roger. Thanks for dropping by. Probably just a chatty one today, but the big question always, how do I care for my orchids? And the simplest answer I can give is I don't. Now, as you all reel back, think about it. What really is looking after my orchids? Is it me or is it this place? Having got this place in what I consider to be a good environment for most of the orchids I grow in, the work is done. Now that work took quite a long time to get right. Basically this was a conservatory. We had a nice big comfy settee in here, a table for putting my coffee or my wine on, or where my book fell if I fell asleep reading it, which I used to do quite often. Lovely place to come for a nap. And the cats used it all the time. Cats love to just lie in the sun in the warm and sleep. It's their favourite occupation, sleeping. But that was all it got used for. And unfortunately, probably for over 2/3 of the year, it couldn't be used. It was either too fucking cold out here to sit around in without your coat, hat and gloves on, or it was just too hot. Once I decided I wanted to keep some plants out here, the first thing to do was do a temperature check. Yeah? Well, in the winter, if it's too cold for me, it's too cold in the main for orchids. That's a very simple thing to establish, but it was just how hot did it get? And there were no openable windows or doors. The door frame is actually rotted, so if you open the door, it's probably going to tear the frame down. So the door is locked shut, stays shut, never gets opened. It would just, the whole place might even fall down, it's that bad. It's not in good nick, this place. The wood is old. And the window was in the same boat. You know, if you opened the window, the bottom strut of the window fell off and just left the glass hanging and had to be pushed back into place and kept shut. So no ventilation. And basically it was getting up to 48, 50 degrees in the summer. Well, that's no good. This is centigrade, obviously, the proper one, not the pretend one. So it was useless for plants, so I had to stop and think, well, how can I make it better? Well, obviously the sun coming in through the glass generates the heat. Right, first thing we'll do is shut that out then. So I put a layer of shade netting round the two sides that get the sun. This side here only gets late setting sun, which isn't too bad. And at the time, that was a window and that was a panel of glass. So this whole side was glass. Well, that dropped the temperature a bit, but nowhere near enough. So, right, let's put another layer of shade netting on and have double thickness. Now that changed it quite a bit, and it did bring the temperature down, but it was still too hot, and obviously very dry air as a consequence, yeah? So still useless. So, right, what else do we do? Well, at the time I tried doing this, it was sort of heading in towards, it was late spring. Heading towards summer, so the sun was getting high in the sky. All right then, put some shade netting on the roof. So we did that, and that made it better, but it still wasn't cool enough. So I thought, well, somehow or other I've got to get the heat out. So I thought, well, if I had an extractor fan up near the roof somewhere, that would suck the heat out, yeah? But that was a glass window, so first thing to do was get rid of the glass window, put a wooden panel in and get myself a fan. Now prior to this, obviously there was no electricity out here, so I had to take a cable from the house, drill a hole in the frame and get power out here, and that evolved into several sort of extension leads with multiple plugs like this one up here. Electrician would go mad if they came out here, because none of this stuff's waterproof, but then I don't get it wet. You know, it's my space. I'm in control of where the water goes. So there's no water gets anywhere near the electrics. But I do have, now, I have high humidity, but not enough to mess up electrics. So we got some electrics out here. We got an extractor fan. Now that did wonders. that actually cooled it down a fair bit. Still not enough. So I thought, well, if we're sucking the warm air out, perhaps we ought to have another fan the other way round and suck in some cooler air. Well, the cooler air is obviously on the shadiest side, down near the ground. So, although it's covered at the moment because it's winter time, well, the air outside is still too cold to start sucking in here. So I put an inlet fan, yeah? And I thought, well, what about days when I'm not here? So I thought, well, if I hook those two up to a thermostat, then they'll only come on when the temperature gets up to a point that I can control. So next job, get a little thermostat. Now these little made in China units are cheap and cheerful, but they do the job. The only faff with them is that the points at which you make the contacts, where you put your wires in and the back, are tiny. So they're not ideal to get wired up, but once they're wired up they just sit there and work. And I mean, they have a you can either use them to heat or to cool. They've got a switch in them, so they're quite sophisticated for such a cheap little unit, but obviously mine's set on the heating side, so sorry, on the cooling side. So I set my temperature at whatever I choose. I think it's currently set at 26, something like that. And then you put in a differential, which is the amount you wish it to change before it turns off. So mine's set to 1 degree. So when the temperature gets up to 26, it turns itself on. When it gets down to 25, it turns off. So that controlled the inlet and the outlet fan. And that nearly did the job. That wasn't bad at all. We got the temperature down quite well. And then I had to look at humidity, and that was too low, really, especially on the warmer days. Very dry air out here, so I thought, well, we need to get some moisture out here somehow. So I got a couple of cheap second-hand, what I call foggers. They're actually humidifiers, designed to work in the home to just raise the humidity up. I mean, people that have asthma and breathing problems can often breathe easier if the air is a bit moister. So anyway, I got a couple of those, and that did the job. So I was sort of set. I had an environment now that had humidity. I was capable of controlling the high temperatures. And then I thought, well, at that time of year it didn't matter, but I thought, yeah, what's going to happen when we get to winter? It's going to get absolutely freezing in here, right? Well, we need a heater then, don't we? So I got a little heater. It's just a little fan heater. It does actually oscillate, but I don't bother. And then I thought, well, hang on, if that heater comes on, hot air rises. Yeah, so yeah, I'm going to get hot spots. So what I did was, first of all, this has got its own thermostat on it, but I don't use it. Basically, I use a separate one, so we've got another little thermostat. And this one's set the opposite to the one that controls those two fans. This one works the other way round. This one turns on when the temperature drops to a certain amount. And then with that 1 degree differential, it's currently set to 13. So when it gets down to 12, this kicks on and brings it back up to 13 and then shuts off. But to make sure I don't get hot spots, I've wired in that circulating fan to that thermostat with the heater, so they both come on together. And that thing whizzes the warm air off the heater around the whole place and distributes it so that I don't get hot spots. And then they shut down and wait till it cools down again, then they came on. So that sorted the winter out. And then you come back to, well, hang on, orchids like good air movement. And with some types of orchids, when you read up on their care, you know, that's quite important. So I thought, right, we need to get the air moving. So I got another version of that on a stand, which isn't in operation at the moment because I'm not getting those high temperatures on a frequent basis. I changed the cheapo foggers for better ones, and well, for me in here, in the middle of the summer, I'll be running 3 of these, Literally. At the moment I only need one. Soon the second one will come out. And I thought, well, I don't want them on all the time. I only want them on as the temperature climbs and the humidity drops. So I bought a little humidity stat. And they work exactly the same. Another cheap and cheerful Chinese thing. And this one literally came from China. The original slow boat from China. It took 2 weeks to get here, but it got here. Not very expensive. And this works in the same way. You set the humidity where you want it, and then you add in the differential of how much you want it to drop down before that kicks in and brings it back up again. So, and that's easily adjusted. So soon we'll be getting the second one out, and then eventually the third one comes out, and that gets wired in differently, because that one gets wired into the inlet and the extractor fan. Because when the extractor fan and the inlet fan kick on, it sucks out my humidity. So I have a third one that fires up when those two fans are going and changing the air, and it just helps keep it moist out here. So that's the sort of gadgets. They chop and change, because obviously soon I won't need the heater, because the nights won't be dropping down as much, so the heater can go. At which point the big fan that's connected to the heater will be disconnected and just fixed up as a manual fan that I'll turn on as and when. I might actually fix it up to the thermostat this year, I haven't decided. I do change things round a little bit as I go along. So I then needed places to put the orchids, so I got some shelves. And I like the wire mesh shelves because it gives me good airflow. Yeah, if you have solid shelves, you have a resistance to air moving around nicely, whereas if you get a mesh type shelf like that, the air's got free flow around the pots, around the plants, and around your growing space, whatever that is. So that was that. We then got some plants out here, and then we got some more plants out here, and then we got some more plants out here, until we get to the state where we're in now, where we've probably got too many plants. So my number of actual individual plants isn't going to change much. If new ones come in, I will probably find some that I'm not so keen on to get rid of. Pass on to others, or if they're really in a poor state of health, they can just go out. If you won't grow, out you go. So back to the orchid care then. The most important thing was getting an environment in which the majority of them are going to be happy. That's most of the work done. Next thing is what type of orchids. Well, that depends on your environment, and it's best to stick to orchids that are going to do well in your environment. A lot of people grow in the home, so what have we got there? You know, the only light we've got is coming in through windows and things like that, so that's our light source. We do the best we can with that. Highlight orchids closer to the glass. Ones that don't need such high light can sit behind those plants and get a bit less, or just move them farther away from the windows. You know, so you've got the control of the light. And then temperatures. Well, if it's your home, it's probably not going to get down to 12, 13 degrees, because you'll all be sat around in your coats and hats. I mean, a home might cool, like mine. My house cools down at night because the heating goes off. I'm snuggled up in bed. I don't need the house really warm when I'm not using it. And then the heating comes back on in the morning. But on a really cold night, the house drops down to about 16. Now, that's not a bad minimum. And in a home, your maximum is often geared up to what's going on outside. You know, that's just turned on. That's because the door's wide open and the sun's come out. Yeah, so the humidity's starting, relative humidity's dropping. So the fogger's come on, just the one at the moment. And yeah, so that's your control. If you're growing in a home, your temperatures are probably fine, but take care not to get too close to glass when it's bitterly cold outside. If you're getting down into those serious minus temperatures, you will have a buffer zone near your windows that's actually quite cool. Yeah, so you've got your heat controlled, and an average heat, minimum 16, 17, maximum, well, if you can keep it below 28, great. If it gets a bit above that, It's starting to get a bit too warm for some orchids, but the temperature range in a home is pretty good. And my temperature range now has got a low minimum because of my resting dendrobiums that aren't anymore, so I don't need to worry so much about that. And I try and keep my high below 28. And with the inlet and the extractor fan, I can manage that most of the time. There are occasions I've had it up as high as 32 in here, but at 32 degrees C I still had 60% humidity, and that's the trick. If your temperatures start getting high, you need to get that humidity up. All orchids like humidity, none of them like dry air. But what do we mean by dry air? Well, there's an average. In a home, it probably gets quite low in the winter when the old heating's on, depending on how you heat. I mean, mine heating is radiators, which do tend to dry out the air. So, you know, well, get some humidity trays, get a mister, fogger, whatever you want to call it, up the humidity in a localized area, do the plants the world of good. And airflow, especially in the home. Most people in the summer have got some windows open, bit of breeze coming through, change the air, all that sort of stuff. But in the winter time, your place is sealed shut to keep the cold out, and you tend to get dry, still air. Well, get a little fan, just move it around a bit. You know, that's all you need. But then we get back down to what orchids are going to grow in that average environment. Well, Phalaenopsis hybrids, they'll do fine. Some Paphiopedilums you can get away with growing in the home. Again, they're not too keen on dry air, but you know, humidity trays and things, you can probably get away with that. The Oncidium intergenerics in the main, they'll probably do okay. There's quite a few dendrobium types, certainly the Nobile hybrids and the Phalaenopsis types, they'll do okay in the home. And when I say in the home, I'm also saying they're going to do okay out here. Some Cattleyas will do fine in a home environment. So already you've got quite a lot of choices. But if you stick to those ones that are going to do okay, and you know they're going to do okay, you cut down the number of failures. You know, if you've got a home that stays at 25, 26 degrees because you like it hot, and your air's dry, you're not going to do very well with things like Masdevallias, or Draculas, or Restrepias, or Pleurophalids, those ones that really need that high humidity. You're probably going to fail with them, or at least they're not going to do well. Or don't have them then, unless you can create a microclimate somehow where they can get those needs. But if you pick on the average ones, the ones that there's plenty of choices of colours, shapes and sizes, you'll probably do okay. So that's the choice of orchids. Then we get on to how do we look after them. Well, first thing is, what are you going to grow them in or on? Now, bearing in mind most of the orchids I've just mentioned are epiphytes. They don't really grow in anything, they grow on things. They grow on branches, they grow on tree trunks, some of them grow on rocks, but they grow on things, not in things. And therein lies the secret. Whatever you plant your orchids in or on needs air. If you shut the air out, you'll suffocate the roots and they will not do well. So you need an airy media. Yeah? And then you have to stop and think about, well, what sort of orchid have I got? There'll be exceptions. And the first thing to do is think about root size and vigour. Yeah? So the big chunky roots tend to like chunky media, where there's plenty of room for them to grow in, you know, in and around and on. Those with the very fine root systems, going back to things like Masdevallias, which you may not choose, but some of the Oncidiums and intergenerics have got very fine root systems. Well, they're going to need a finer mix. So you choose what you're going to plant, what you're going to put in your pots based on initially the root size. And then there's a really important thing to consider. Does my orchid need to stay moist? Does it need to dry out or almost dry out? Or does it need to totally dry out between my waterings? And then add into that, does my orchid not only need to dry out but need to do it fast. Yeah, and that will determine your media. And Cattleya is like a wet-dry cycle, and the faster that can happen, the better, because it means they're not sat in anything soggy for any length of time, because they've got a fast wet-dry cycle. Exceptions. Tolumnias are an exception. Very, very fine root system. So you might think, right, I need to get some seedling bark with some sphagnum moss and plant them up in that. Oh, well, that's not the best of ideas for Tolumnias, because although they've got a very fine root system, where they come from, they have a daily, fast, wet, dry cycle. They get morning dew, quite high humidity, and they get that morning dew virtually every day. Yeah, so they get some water every day, and they've adapted to take that water in fast, because they might not get any more that day. So there's always exceptions. But that really is about it, until you get on to watering and feeding. Now, again, does your orchid need to stay moist? Well, if it needs to stay moist all the time, planting it in chunky bark is probably not going to achieve the goal. Yeah? So you might want to come down a size in the bark, or even 2 sizes. You might want to add some moss in there as well, especially if it's a fine-rooted orchid. So your choice of media is quite important. And then we get on to mounted orchids. There aren't that many orchids that won't do well mounted, but you do have to think about the workload. Now, I watered my non-resting mounts yesterday, and most of my resting ones as well. They just had a flush. Well, there's quite a few in here now. We didn't have a sunny day yesterday, but they're dry. So every other day is now no good. So I'm back to looking at a lot of my mounted orchids every single day because they're drying out on a daily basis. It's the best wet-dry cycle you can get. My Tolumnias love it. They're all putting on new growth and things now. So watering is geared up to, does it need to stay moist? If so, keep your eye on the pots, and as they start to look as though they're getting a bit dry, give them some more water. Yeah? If they need to totally dry, well, have they done that yet? If they haven't, they don't need their water yet. Yeah? And this is at plant by plant and pot by pot basis. The next thing is feed. Controversial subject, what to feed with, how often and how much. Well, I'm not going to tell you. This is for you to work out, because it's a controversial subject. If I say one thing, I'll get some people totally disagree with it. And if I said what they use, then I'll get another load that will disagree with it. But I don't think you can go far wrong by feeding low levels frequently. Yeah, orchids don't need a huge amount of food, quite honestly. In their natural environment, they don't get much. So, you know, feed low and feed often when the plants are growing. If your plant is not growing and sitting there doing nothing, then you don't need to do much either. Yeah? Again, plant by plant basis. So, yes, I have to intervene to look after my orchids, otherwise they'd stay bone dry and die. So, watering and feeding is my workload. The care is the place they're in, and that does most of my work for me. So if you can put some effort into getting a good environment that your orchids are going to thrive in, then all you need to do is look after the watering and the feeding. And that really is not a big deal. You know, once you find something that you can feed with that has all the appropriate elements in suitable proportions, and I highly recommend a TDS meter, because it just takes the guesswork out, quite honestly. So a lot of recommended doses, quite honestly, are just too high. Yeah, you take a TDS meter and check your water after you've put your feed in. You know what they're getting. And by aiming low, what I mean is, for my really light feeders and those that object to any form of build-up in the pots, that's Masdevallias, Restrepias, if I ever get any Draculas, Miltoniopsis, They do not like lots of stuff around their roots. They like quite pure water. My Deesas, you know, you get salt build up in Deesas, they will die. Use tap water on them, they're probably going to die. They're very sensitive roots. So a low level of feed for me is a TDS level of 80 to 100. The more actively, more vigorously growing plants, I would take up to about 150. But it's the frequency, you see. I know some people feed like once a fortnight, and they really stonk their feed levels up with TDS values of 500 or 600. But then they don't feed again for a couple of weeks. I'm not sure. Well, personally, I don't agree with that. I just don't. Simple as that. I think a trickle feed frequently does the orchids a bit more good and is a bit more along the lines of how they might be growing in their natural environment. A lot of the orchids I just mentioned as recommended for sort of getting a collection together, they don't exist in the wild. They're hybrids. The intergenerics don't exist in the wild. You know, the Phalaenopsis, the common ones that you get in the supermarkets and places like that, they don't exist in the wild. They're all complex hybrids. Most of the Cattleyas you're going to come across are in the same boat. They're complex. And I mean, some of those are effectively intergenerics. You know, when you just bought one that says BLC, well, that's got some Brassivola in there somewhere, some Laelia in there, and some Cattleya in there. And chances are half of those have been renamed and it's not even a BLC anymore. But what it probably isn't or wasn't was pure Cattleya. That's what you're getting at. It's got other things in it. They're all Cattleya Alliance plants. So, but yeah, so if you get the environment right, then the rest of the work becomes easier. It means your plants will do better, which is far more rewarding and pleasing. Having plants going down left, right and centre is not, you know, it takes the edge off the hobby, certainly, and some people might even give up, you know, but an average environment and get average plants that are readily available and you should do okay. Once you start venturing out into the obscure and the unknown, well, trying to find out how to look after them also becomes obscure and in some cases unknown. You know, you get these really obscure things that nobody else has got, or hardly anybody's had, then who provides the care guides? Yeah? You think about it. So anyway, just a chat about looking after orchids. It shouldn't be difficult unless you've got an environment that just isn't suited to the plants you've got. Then you're going to work hard to try and keep them alive. I always forget something. If you're going to get humidifiers, yeah, effectively most of them that you get are working on an ultrasonic basis. That process produces cool mist, yeah? If that gets directly onto your plants to the extent that your plants are getting wet, what have you just done to your leaves? You've just chilled them, yeah? And you're going to keep them chilled by keep pouring mist onto them that is naturally cold. Now, I know that mine's cold. All I got to do is put my hand in it. It's chilled. It does come out quite cold. The air in here at the moment is 22 degrees. The stuff coming out in there is a lot cooler. So what's going to happen to the mist that comes out of there? It's going to go straight downwards. Yeah? So putting it at the lowest point might not be the best of ideas, because most of the mist is going to drop away from your orchids. So if you're going to have a humidifier, it needs to go higher than the orchids so that it will naturally fall down. But if it's going to fall down through the plants, make sure it's far enough away that it is in true mist form and does not get the plants actually soggy wet. Yeah? A little bit of mist on the leaves might not do them a lot of harm, especially in warmer temperatures. It might even help cool the leaves down, but go steady with these things. They do produce a cold mist. Yeah? And the idea is to humidify the air, not get the plants soaking wet and freezing cold. So watch these things. They're great, don't get me wrong, I love them. but the positioning of them can be quite important. You know, don't get them too close to the plants. That I mean, it's a bit like if you think of the steam that comes out of the kettle. Well, true steam is invisible. If you look at the nozzle of your kettle, the first couple of inches there's nothing there. I wouldn't recommend putting your finger in there. That's very, very hot, a lot hotter than boiling water. But then you get the steam that you can see, and it's hot, yeah? And if you notice the steam that comes out of your kettle, does it drop down? No, it travels up, because it's normally hotter than the air it's hitting, so it goes upwards, yeah? But the mist out of these is cool, and it drops down. So don't get it too close to your plants. I mean, if I turned that nozzle round there, this poor little plant here would be in a chilled, misty blast, because it's quite close, only sort of 9 inches. So I turn that so that it points over here, and then it gets hit by that, and that distributes it, yeah? The next fogger that I set up soon is going to go higher in my environment, and I haven't worked out quite how I'm going to do it, but I want to get it up. I want to get it up nearer the roof. My problem being that certainly in the warmer weather it needs filling up every day, so it needs to go up somewhere, but in a place where I can get at it so that I can lift it down and fill it up again. So again, playing with the environment. But anyway, I need to get that shade netting on, so let's get cracking. Right, I just wanted to show that in its sort of proper working environment. Now you see what I mean about the mist dropping. It's a cool mist, it drops down. And why it isn't dropping down at the moment is that circulating fan's on, and it's whizzing it around, so it's mixing it with all of the air in here. But that's the test. That is freezing cold. Yeah? And look at my hand now, it's wet. So that's, you don't want your plants that close. Yeah? If I turn that round there, yeah, it's going to get that plant soaking wet in about 10 minutes, and it's very cold water that it will be getting on the leaves, and that's actually Nellie Isla. It might actually do it some good, but they do like to stay cooler. But that's why it's turned away from the plants and distributed with a fan, so it blows it around. And the other thing I wanted to say about these is what you put in there is what comes out there. Yeah? Now my tap water has got a TDS reading of about 270, 280. It's full of calcium and other stuff unknown. So if I put tap water in there, that's what's going to come out of there in the mist, and it's going to put deposits on the plants. That calcium's got to go somewhere, yeah? So I use RO water in my misters, and that way pure water is coming out in mist form, so it can do no deposits on the leaves or anything like that. It's just pure water that gets mixed in with the air and keeps the humidity up. Yeah, so have a think about what you put in your foggers as well. The purer the water in there, the better, and it stops the build-up of calcium on the working unit, the little ultrasonic thing that vibrates. You know, if that gets all calcified, it's just not going to do the job properly. So it also helps keep the inside clean. Yeah. So that's foggers. So there we go then, that's today's video. And I mean, at the moment the sun is coming and going, comes out from behind the clouds and disappears again. So it's keeping my temperature in here about 23, 24, yeah? And the fogger's keeping the humidity, or it will be when I shut the door again, around the sort of 67, 68%, which at that temperature is fine. So that air environment with the fan moving the air around, moving the mist around, keeping the whole place in a similar sort of form at those temperatures is absolutely brilliant for nearly all of the orchids in here. And I say nearly all of them because already at 23, 24, 25 degrees it's too warm for some of my orchids. They're pushing the boundaries. And you can push boundaries at lower and higher temperatures, and therein comes a little bit of a risk. You know, if you've got very cool growing orchids and they're starting to get warm, well, if you keep the humidity as high as you can, they might do okay, but they're not going to do as well as if you could keep them cooler. And then we always tend to forget there are some orchids that are classed as warm to hot growers. Now they really don't like their temperatures dropping down at all. So obviously they're pushing the boundaries as well. Now I don't believe I've actually got any of those. I've got some that like to stay warm, yes, but not warm to hot. There might be a couple of bulbophyllums lurking around in that category, but I haven't checked them at individual plant level yet, so you know, I may be pushing my luck with some of those. But in the main, all the Oncidium intergenerics in the main, with the exception of Nellie Isla and Miltoniopsis, are happy at this temperature and at that humidity level. The Cattleyas are fine, the Dendrobiums are fine, all the other obscurities, epidendrums, you know, sort of the various other things that are lurking around in here. A lot of the Coelogenes, although some of those might prefer it a little bit cooler, but with the humidity I'm getting away with it. So it's a matter of getting an environment that works. When you've got that, you can add orchids in that like that environment pretty safely. And all you got to worry about is buying one with no flipping roots. Anyway, see you again. Thanks for dropping by.